the general fund and looking at, and I may ask Bill to come up here so I don't misspeak, but and looking at page A31 on the budget, which is somewhat changed here, but when you look at reserves and the total dollars and as a percent of revenues over the next 5-6 years, again, I'm going to read what's on A31, and Bill said that it's lower than what they're showing here, but you're talking about reserves going up to $850 million in 2027, and which represents 50%, up to 50%, not 15, not 22, not 23, but in essence, and again, I think I don't want to focus on that number as much as I want to focus on the fact that over the next 5 to 6 years, we have a large increase in our reserves that I think begs the question, why? I know some of those we have some ideas what to spend on, but for me, I think a line item in our expense that talks about a payment, an additional payment to our tax, our gas tax fund, which would allow us, I'm thinking the same way Commissioner Peters was, to do a rollback rate. I was talking about more from a reserve standpoint, but I know you were speaking from the ARPA standpoint. But either way, it seems as though we have monies in there to do the capital programs that are anticipated to use those reserves, and at the same time also have an additional line item for our gas tax fund. One of the things that we talked about a year ago, again, just to remind everybody, and I was out there talking to folks about doing a 2-year budget, and I was really proud of the fact that we were looking at that pandemic and not understanding what it was going to do to us. And so we were being extra cautious to say, well, if we had a collapse in sales tax and we had a collapse in property taxes, that we don't want to be raising millage rates next year. So we cut costs to a level, frankly, that were the same as the year before. And so I commended staff on that, and then we took advantage of the property tax values, and so our reserves went up. I'm not sure if it was 23, 24%, but we used some of that to good use during this year. So we have the opportunity, and again, I'm just looking at this form, and Bill, you can talk to it right now. But I just think it's an opportunity for us to just pause a little bit and think about what we told our residents, that indeed we're going to protect you if we have an economic collapse, which we did not. So let's give it back to them. And I think it's, again, I'm not saying what's the best way to do it, but I think I'd like, Bill, if you can talk to the reserve levels over the next 5 to 6 years and maybe bring those numbers down to a more realistic number than what you first published in the very beginning. So go ahead.
So, Commissioner, the page that you're referring to in the proposed budget was part of our budget forecast for the general fund. Yeah. And that page has not yet been fully updated to reflect the fact that we're going to have $12 million going to the Transportation Trust Fund. It's also not been updated based on some other changes that were reflected in the tentative budget, which is now the budget that you're looking at potentially adopting tonight. And as a result, what you will see is that there is still going to be growing reserves based on the forecast throughout the forecast period.
Okay.
The rate of ascent of reserves is not going to be as steep as what you see in the proposed budget.
Not as steep or not as high?
Not as steep, not as high.
Yeah. Okay.
And part of that is also reflected in the fact that in the proposed budget, the millage rate that was reflected there was 5.1768. However, the effective, and I'm going to say effective, budget that's going to impact the general fund year in, year out, if you adopt the budget that you're presented with today, is 5.0023, which is the full rollback rate, plus the dedicated increment that's going to come into the general fund and go directly right back out to the Transportation Trust Fund. Right. So that will have no positive impact on reserves for the general fund. So that's the reason that when you look at that chart and you see the adopted budget version of that chart, yeah, for the forecast for the future years, you will see continued growth forecast, but not as much growth as is currently reflected in the proposed.
But if we didn't transfer those monies, right, the real millage rate would be the full rollback.
That is correct, sir.
Okay. Just want to make sure I'm clear on that, and how we can arrive at that by using some reserves instead of using, they're all general fund money, but I'm talking about below the line versus above the line. So just, just another way of accomplishing what we're trying to do.
That would be an alternative strategy.
Yeah.
That's not what's currently reflected in
I
what's
got
being
it.
proposed.
I got it. So I think, again, I just think it's just an opportunity that we have to, and again, whether it's ARPA funds or whether it's this, I mean, again, I get back to and I asked the question last meeting whether ARPA funds could be used. We talked about tax shortfalls, and certainly there's an element of the gas tax last year that had a shortfall, and whatever, and to that extent, those funds are legitimate uses for reinvesting in those shortfalls. So I just think we have opportunities here to do a full rollback, so I would agree with that, and look for some consideration from the commission for that discussion. And if that's not the case, then we will, move on. Okay. So I'm seeing, obviously, no appetite for that. I'm assuming that what could be done is to go through the process and have a motion in a second and vote it down and then come back to the motion on the table. So if anybody wants to make a motion, now's the time to make a motion. Make sure I'm correct on that. Yeah, all right. The board must now consider the resolutions to set the final millage rates and budgets. As stated earlier, we will adopt the final millage rates and budgets in the following sections. Is this the time that we need to address the millage rate? And I just want to make sure I'm not out of line here. I know we have the script going forward, but I'm not hearing any motions at this point. Is that correct?
You're correct.
That's correct, sir.
So it's after
There was no
that
motion,
change.
so